Kamala's closing at the Ellipse in Washington turned into a festival of Jew hatred. The Biden family is tying up loose ends in the criminal investigations, or one loose end, named Gal Luft. And finally, Israel cut off ties with the UN's in-house terrorist organization, UNRWA, and the Biden-Harris administration goes nuts. I'll have information on all these stories coming up on In Focus. So a story came in just before we started filming about what happened at the Kamala Harris closing speech at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday night. I want you to watch a clip.
These people are nuts. They're nuts. This is what you get if you vote for Kamala. These fine people will be coming to your neighborhood.
So this is a guy named Charlie R. Downs. He posted it on his Twitter feed, and it shows that among the thousands of people who showed up to hear Kamala Harris's closing remarks, that is, this is supposed to be the speech that just shuts down Trump before the election, she was regaled by a crowd of thousands of Hamas supporters calling for an intifada revolution in the United States. That is a terrorist assault on the United States of America. And they're doing this where? At Kamala Harris's closing speech. Why did they feel so comfortable? Let's look at the footage again. Look at all of the Palestinian flags. Listen to what they're saying.
Intifada, intifada. These people are nuts. They're nuts.
Here, I think it's important to add just, in parenthetically, in parentheses, right, that on Shabbat morning, Saturday morning, an Orthodox Jewish man walking to synagogue in the Jewish neighborhood of West Rogers Park in Chicago was shot. Here, let's just look at the footage of the shooting. You hear what the guy is calling out? Allahu Akbar, right? So my friend and colleague, Eugene Kontorovich, who was on the Caroline Glick show just a few weeks ago, he tweeted the following on his feed. It says that the name of the shooter was Sidi Mohammed Abdullahi. And yet Chicago Mayor Brandon, who is a communist, he refuses to mention the fact that the victim was a Jew or that the perpetrator was a Muslim. He refuses to report it as a hate crime, and the assailant is not being charged for a hate crime, even though it's self-evidently a hate crime. Richard Goldberg from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, also a frequent visitor on the Caroline Glick show, has been following this very closely on his Twitter feed, and he notes that both the Illinois Counterterrorism Task Force has not been convened by Governor Pritzker. Nobody's said anything about the obvious terrorist character of the assault, that the perpetrator was a Muslim screaming out Allahu Akbar. And there's a real question about why it is that they've been trying to shield the identity of Sidi Mohammed Abdullahi. And right now, the theory going out is that he was illegal. They said that he's from Africa. That's what authorities have said. So he's either from Mauritania or from Egypt, and they're hiding this from the public. Why aren't they treating this as a terrorist case? Who knows? But this is what is happening today in the United States. There was another Orthodox man who was stabbed. He was slashed and his face critically wounded in Crown Heights in Brooklyn yesterday, Tuesday. So this is happening now, and the people showing up at the Kamala Harris closing remarks are screaming out, globalize the intifada revolution from the river to the sea, calling for the annihilation of the Jewish people. And they're greeted, right, as, accepted guests. So that just came across the story about the Kamala rally, or the rally for genocide, that is what her final speech or whatever at the Ellipse deteriorated into. So I just thought I'd open with that little snippet of news. But of course, she calls Trump a fascist, and I think Biden just called Trump supporters garbage. Well, look in the mirror. Anyway, speaking of Joe Biden, So I don't know if you guys remember way back before the war, in February of 2023, I think I might have only reported on it in March of 2023, but in February of 2023, a colleague of mine, an old colleague of mine that I had lost touch with named Dr. Gal Luft, who ran a think tank in Washington in the early 2000s that was devoted to finding replacements to oil and fossil fuels from a national security perspective in order to reduce American dependency after 9/11 on Arab oil. So I don't know, somewhere after I stopped, I think the last time I saw Gal was in 2009. And then suddenly in February of 2023, he tweets this incredibly astounding tweet. Let me just read it to you. It's dated February 19th, 2023. It says, "I've been arrested in Cyprus on a politically motivated extradition request by the United States. The U.S. claiming I'm an arms dealer. It would be funny if it weren't tragic. I've never been an arms dealer. DOJ is trying to bury me to protect Joe, Jim, and Hunter Biden. Shall I name names?" Gal actually went on the lam. He was released pending his extradition trial in Cyprus, and he ran away, I think somewhere around March 23rd. And I wrote about him in an article here at JNS in March of 2023. And what I summarized there was what actually the entire case was about. So it works out that in March of 2019, about 6 weeks before Joe Biden declared that he was running for president, so when Joe Biden was a former vice president, Gal had met with federal investigators from the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York that had flown to Brussels to meet him at the U.S. Embassy in Brussels. And there he gave them leads on at least 26 different leads that would prove corruption by Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, Jim Biden, Hallie Biden in their relationship with a Chinese oil company called CEFC. And he talked about, I think it was, $9 million that had been transferred to the Biden family, including the big guy, which Gal identified as the former vice president, Joe Biden, that Joe Biden had met with the leaders of the CEFC. Gal knew all of this information because he was told it by the same senior CEFC officials who he was working with through a nonprofit that the Chinese oil company had opened up in Washington. It's a 501c3 that was registered in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So they're operating legally in the United States as a non-for-profit organization, working with Gal's non-for-profit organization and holding conferences in Washington, in Hong Kong, about replacing oil with synthetic fuels and other things. So he's working with them in that, and he developed close ties with the executives of this Chinese oil company, including Patrick Ho, who was later arrested by the United States, and Chairman Yi, who ran away just before he was arrested to China and disappeared into the mist of Beijing years ago. Okay, so Gal is in touch with all of these people. These people are telling him how they are carrying out an influence peddling relationship with Biden through his son, Hunter, and his brother, Jim, and that they are transferring millions of dollars to the Biden family. He also told the federal investigators that the money was also being transferred to the Biden family, and they in turn tipped the Chinese off to the fact that federal investigators in the Southern District of New York and the FBI had issued 4 arrest warrants against senior CEFC executives and were able to prevent them from being arrested as a result of this tip-off. It also implicated a former senior law enforcement official who was later, after Gal's entire episode became public, was identified by some people as former FBI Director Louis Freeh, who is also from Delaware and is ostensibly a friend of the Biden family. At any rate, he was referred to in the internal communications that Gal shared with investigators as One-Eye, and Freeh has a problem with one of his eyes. So that was thought of as a description, and that's why later investigators or later journalists were alleging that it was Louis Freeh. I have no information about that, but that is what people think. And that it was Louis Freeh that was getting this information for the Bidens to transfer to the Chinese about arrest orders that were issued against the senior executives of CEFC. At any rate, so Gal had come forward in March of 2019 with this information to federal investigators, and he just kept waiting to hear about the investigation. In fact, he only met with them because they pledged that they would actively investigate any information that he brought in this hearing or in this meeting that he had with them at the U.S. Embassy in Brussels. So they never investigated. 6 weeks later, Joe Biden announced that he was running for president. In October of 2020, just a few weeks before the election, Miranda Devine, the reporter at the New York Post, published all of the information that she had from Hunter Biden's laptop that he had abandoned at a Delaware repair shop a couple of months earlier, and she received the laptop from Rudy Giuliani, who was Trump's attorney at the time. And she went through it, and the New York Post was able to authenticate the laptop, and they published the findings. And we all remember what happened to Miranda Devine's story. The New York Post was deplatformed by Twitter under its former leadership that was actively censoring on behalf of the FBI conservative Twitter feeds on COVID, and then they just took the entire platform of the New York Post down. Facebook also censored the story. Everybody censored the story. They not only removed the New York Post's account and all of the information, they removed accounts of people who were citing the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop. And then senior Biden campaign advisor and longtime Biden foreign policy advisor, now Secretary of State Tony Blinken, organized 51 former senior officials in the intelligence community that put out a statement saying that the laptop had all the markings of a Russian disinformation operation, meaning that the laptop wasn't real, that none of the information about it was real. But the fact is that all of the information that was exposed about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden and Jim Biden's ties to the Chinese energy company, CEFC, was actually revealed to the FBI and the Southern District of New York investigators by Gal Luft in March of 2019, and they had covered the entire thing up for a year and a half until it was exposed by the New York Post, and then they denied it and pretend that it was a lie and never came forward and said it was true. So in the intervening years, as we know, congressional investigators led by Congressman James Comer began investigating the laptop and all of the information. And only just a few months ago, the administration, the Department of Justice, finally acknowledged that the laptop, in fact, was real. But in the meantime, its contents were authenticated by Biden's former business partner, Tony Bobulinski, by IRS whistleblowers, Agents Shapley and Ziegler, who came forward and spoke to congressional investigators, and also other former business associates of Hunter Biden. So all of this information has been authenticated since Gal brought it forward for the first time in March 2019. And the investigators did nothing with the information. 18 months later, they denied the truth of the allegations that he had already brought to them in 2019. And then in February of 2023, they arrested him in Cyprus in an arrest warrant that had gone out just before the midterm elections in 2022 that the Democrats expected losing, meaning that the Republicans would suddenly have subpoena power to investigate all of the allegations against Hunter Biden, Jim Biden, and leading into President Biden. By the way, since then, Comer was able to authenticate the fact that transfers to Biden's personal accounts that were originating from CEFC, money transfers to Biden relatives, that is, Comer was able to authenticate that actual payments were made indirectly to Joe Biden through this money trail that started with CEFC. And again, all of the information, or a large amount of the information that the congressional investigators have gotten, and that the FBI and the IRS belatedly authenticated, as being real came initially from Gal Luft. So he's like patient zero for COVID, right? He's the first guy. He was the first person who came forward with all of this information in March of 2019. And in February of 2023, he was arrested and he put out that tweet. Now, why am I talking about information that happened a year and a half ago? And the reason is because I just learned that on September 3rd, Gal was arrested again. He was apparently, found by contractors for federal investigators and brought back to jail in Cyprus. And it also works out, so he's in jail. He's been in jail since September 3rd. It also works out that while he was on the lam, that Cyprus did something unprecedented in its legal history, which is that it conducted an extradition trial in absentia, so that they agreed to an American request to extradite extradite Gal Luft to the United States, where he's wanted on these arms trafficking charges that could land him in the big house for 99 years, that he obviously denies, so that the Cypriot court agreed to extradite him to the United States. And they didn't inform his attorneys at the time, or current attorneys either. So what his attorneys did was they filed, after he was arrested, what's called a request for a habeas hearing to have him released from custody. And their claim is that, let me just, how did I put it in my notes, is that the U.S. never told the Cypriot investigators or court authorities about the nature, the politically sensitive information that Gal Luft had presented to federal investigators in Brussels. So they didn't know anything about the backstory of Gal Luft's ties, relations with federal authorities, and the meeting that he had with these federal investigators. And so they claim, his lawyers, and I think rightly, that that's how the U.S. Officials who requested the extradition from Cyprus were able to circumvent the political exception that appears in the bilateral extradition treaty between the United States and Cyprus. It was like, any extradition treaty says, well, we can't extradite your national for trial in your country because we believe that he is being persecuted for political reasons. So you can't, without knowledge of what he did in Brussels, without anything on the backstory, the Cypriot officials are flying blind. They don't know, they can't understand the nature of the extradition request. And the U.S. officials are supposed to imminently respond to Luft's attorney's requests to release him from jail. And that would all be bad enough, and I'd probably be talking about it with you guys anyway, but there's an even more incredible aspect to this story, which is that today, October 30th, as I film, President Biden is scheduled to meet with the president of Cyprus. Now, this isn't like, meeting with the prime minister of Israel or the prime minister of Britain, for that matter, or the president of France, because there hasn't been a White House meeting between an American president, a Cypriot leader, for 28 years. I mean, he is not a frequent flyer to Washington, to the White House, right? And it's not just that. It's also that the visit was only announced, the invitation was only given to the Cypriot president 3 days ago. So on October 26th, or 4 days ago, the president of Cyprus receives the first invitation any Cypriot president ever received in the past 28 years to come in this century, right, to visit the White House. The visit is scheduled for, less than a week before the presidential election, before, for instance, Donald Trump may be elected president by Joe Biden. And they're supposed to be meeting later today in the White House. And this is at the same time, really, on November 1st, so 2 days later, is supposed to be the hearing that at the Cypriot courtroom. So they're supposed to meet October 30th. November 1st, Friday, the Cypriot court is supposed to convene and rule on Luft's attorney's request that he be released rather than transferred to the United States. And so I find all of this rather scandalous and shocking, sort of like the ICC, the International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan's, sudden decision, right, to issue an arrest warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu just, 2 weeks after he found out that an employee of his at the ICC had complained that he carried out very serious sexual harassment against her, not once, but over a period of, months. So that this was a very serious charge. And he decided that he needed an arrest warrant. As here, the presidential elections are next week. Suddenly, it's absolutely urgent for the president of the United States to meet with the president of Cyprus. First time this has happened in 28 years. 2 days before a Cypriot judge is supposed to decide on an extradition order against somebody who's the original whistleblower in relation to allegations of serious crimes having been carried out by the Biden family. So this is all very, very distressing. And I wanted to be sure to get this story out today, October 30th, as the president and as the two presidents, the president of the United States and the presidents of Cyprus, meet at the White House. So I thought that was an important thing to put out. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about what's going on vis-a-vis this war. A lot of people, have said actually Israel's designation of this war as a seven-front war that's being led by Iran and being fought by Iran directly, as we've seen, and also by its proxies and 6 other fronts in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria. Those are all the fronts that Iran is using to wage this massive war against Israel. A lot of people say that it's 7 fronts plus 1. 8th front is the United Nations. So because the United Nations is acting as a diplomatic arm, essentially, of Hamas, with all of its trials against Israel, against Israeli leaders. We're being tried for the crimes that had been committed against us by Hamas, by the Palestinians, by Iran, genocide, right? We're being tried for that at a UN court, at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. The ICC, which is a court that we're not even a member of, it wants to issue arrest warrants against our leaders. And at the UN, Israel is constantly being condemned and reviled as a matter of course. And the most important thing is UNRWA, the UN agency, the only UN agency in the entire UN system that's designated to deal with one group of people only in the entire world, and that's the Palestinians. So I want to talk about UNRWA, because yesterday the Knesset, in a 92-0 vote, voted to ban all official contact with Israel, ban all official contact between Israeli authorities and UNRWA, ban UNRWA from operating in Israel. And why did we do it? So first, we did it because UNRWA is a terrorist organization. Let's just cut to the chase. And now I'll explain. So UNRWA was established after the establishment of the State of Israel, and in 1949 as a refugee agency that is dedicated only to the Arabs who left the area of the land of Israel following or in the course of the pan-Arab invasion of Israel that began on May 15th, 1948, the day that Israel declared independence. So Israel declares independence. It's invaded by 7 Arab armies, another 7-front war, and the UN, following the war, establishes a refugee agency that's dedicated only to serving the Arabs who left the land of Israel, left what became the State of Israel in the course of this pan-Arab invasion. Okay, they left, they relocated to Syria, to Lebanon, to Jordan, to what is today, to Gaza, to Judea and Samaria. And for all refugee groups all over the world, you have one organization. It's called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And the UNHRC, their mission is to resettle refugees. So if you are a victim of fighting, whether in Ukraine or in Rwanda or anywhere else in the world, and you were forced to leave your home and you become a refugee, you receive refugee status from the UN, then the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is supposed to resettle you somewhere so that you can get a new home somewhere else far away from the war zone. But that's not what happened with the Arabs who left the land of Israel in the midst of the pan-Arab invasion of 1948-49. Instead, UNRWA was established. UNRWA set up refugee camps for the Arabs who left the land of Israel in all of the countries around the State of Israel, whether in Judea and Samaria, which was annexed by Jordan unlawfully in 1950, or in Gaza, which was controlled by Egypt, or in Syria or in Lebanon, Jordan proper, and so on and so forth. So all over these areas, the UN, UNRWA set up refugee camps. Now, unlike all of the work done by the UNHCR, these refugee camps weren't supposed to be emptied as the Arabs resettled or received citizenship in the Arab lands that they had run away to. Instead, the purpose of UNRWA was to block them from ever being resettled, from ever receiving from ever moving on in their lives. It was to maintain them as a perpetual refugee population. And this wasn't just for the Arabs who left the land of Israel in 1948-49, but it was for generations to come. So now we're in the fifth or sixth generation since 1948-49, and the status of refugee that prevents all of these people from ever being naturalized anywhere, including in the places that they've lived in now for 5 or 6 generations, is the purpose of UNRWA. It's to maintain them as a refugee population over time so that they can be constantly at war against Israel. And how do we know that that's the purpose? Because everything that they're taught in their UN textbooks, whether it's in Gaza or it's in Beirut, is that they have to seek the annihilation of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. That's what they're taught in schools that are run by this UN agency, UNRWA. Okay, so UNRWA has been perhaps, I don't want to say the central cause of the perpetuation of the Arab-Israel conflict, and specifically of the Palestinian-Arab refusal to accept Israel's right to exist and live at peace with the Jewish state. But it's certainly one of the main reasons, because these people are responsible for a population of millions of Arabs that are the distant descendants, maybe, of Arabs who left the land of Israel in 1948-49, and they are still immiserated because of that lineage and blocked from ever living normal lives because of that. So that is one reason why Israel has always had a very bad relationship with UNRWA, because it's always, and by design, has been a highly, highly hostile organization towards the Jewish state. Its purpose is to perpetuate the Arab-Israel conflict to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and it does it. And it does it with billions of dollars of a budget every year from the UN. Much of it is paid for by U.S. taxpayers, up to $1 billion a year. Now have, in recent years since Hamas took over Gaza, has been transferred to the Palestinians through UNRWA. Okay, so that was bad enough, and that we knew, and that we complained about, and that riled us from 1949 until October 6th. But then something happened. October 7th happened, and you know what happened on October 7th? And since, so on October 7th itself, I wasn't quite sure when I was going through either 9 or 12 UNRWA employees were identified as members of the invasion force of Hamas that carried out the massacre, rape, kidnapping, mutilation, burning alive of 1,200 Israelis in the communities and bases that they overran on October 7, 2023. And we've seen the footage here of this UNRWA medical worker. You see him here outside of the kibbutz, and he is picking up the body of an Israeli who was murdered, Samarango, I think his name is, and dragging him into his vehicle and bringing him to Gaza, where the body remains captive still today. And then, another high-profile one was just last week on October 24th. Israel killed a Hamas battalion leader. His name was his name was Atawi, Muhammad Abu Atawi. Now, Muhammad Abu Atawi was Barrage battalion commander. He commanded the massacre at the Re'im bomb shelter outside of the Nova Music Festival. If you remember, we've talked about it in the past. The revelers at the Nova Music Festival, when they started being massacred by Hamas, when Hamas came into the festival by paragliders and by jeeps and and started murdering the party goers. So they ran away. They were running away. Most of them were killed in their cars on the road that Hamas was able to block, and massacred them, burned them alive, raped them, and kidnapped them from their cars. But about 27 Israelis ran to this bomb shelter in Re'im, and they may have run initially because they were being bombarded by missiles and drones from Gaza that started exactly at 6:29. At any rate, they were hiding in this bomb shelter, and it was Atawi and his men that came and massacred them. So we talked about this on this show because Hirsch Goldberg Polin and 5 other Israelis were kidnapped from there, and because we had their acts of true heroism where one of the victims was a Nahal Brigade soldier, and he was able to intercept these grenades that they were throwing into the shelter and throw them back. He threw out 9. Ner Shapiro was his name, and Ner Shapiro was able to throw, I think, 8 grenades that they were throwing into the shelter back out of the shelter until he was killed by the 9th grenade or by an RPG. It's not quite clear, that was shot into the shelter. And so 16 people, including Ner Shapiro, were killed. 4 people, including Hirsch Goldberg Poland, were kidnapped, and 7 people were rescued. They were able to survive. They pretended that they were dead. They hid under the bodies of their friends, and they were able to be rescued from the shelter. So Atawi was the one who commanded the massacre, and he was hired by UNRWA in July of 2022. And last week, Israel announced that they had killed him in an operation in Gaza. So what happened after Atawi was announced dead? Oh, well, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who goes back to, the 1970s as a PLO supporter and hater of Israel, he could barely even condemn the October 7th massacre. It took him months and months and months to acknowledge that Israeli women had been brutally raped by the Hamas invaders that day. And he has done everything that he possibly can to criminalize Israel's war of national salvation in Gaza, in Lebanon, and of course vis-a-vis Iran, where you had a Security Council meeting convened, an emergency meeting convened this week to attack Israel for counter-assaulting in Iran over the weekend after they attacked Israel with the ballistic missiles on October 1st. So Guterres is a big hater of Israel. We know this. He was declared persona non grata rightly by Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz last month, I think. And so he came out and he attacked Israel, condemned Israel for killing Atawi. And he didn't care that he was a terrorist. Israel assesses that at least 10% of all UNRWA employees in Gaza are in fact also Hamas members. I think that that's actually a gross underestimate. Why? Because what we found in the last 12 months, particularly in the most high intensity of time of the war, of the ground operation last winter, is that UNRWA headquarters in Gaza City was also Hamas headquarters that was located right beneath UNRWA headquarters. UNRWA schools, UNRWA clinics are used not only as weapon stores, but as missile launchers. You have UNRWA teachers, UNRWA doctors who are credibly accused by released hostages of having been holding them in their private homes and starving them to death. We saw that in the bunker that Sinwar, Hamas leader, was living in with his family. They were being fed by humanitarian relief that was by food that was made in UNRWA bags. In fact, UNRWA bags are found all over Hamas headquarters. So UNRWA is responsible right now for distributing all of the humanitarian aid into Gaza. And since UNRWA and Hamas are indivisible, by giving this job to UNRWA, basically the United States is requiring that Israel allow Hamas to distribute aid, and so they distribute it to themselves, and they're able to sell it in the open market and finance their continued chokehold over Gaza, their continued control over all civilian aspects of life in Gaza because of UNRWA, because UNRWA is Hamas. And that's the thing, is that what Israel really discovered after October 7th is that UNRWA isn't just something that indoctrinates Gazans and Palestinians Palestinian Arabs or supposed Palestinian Arabs, descendants of Arabs who left the land of Israel in the war of 1948-49, it's not just that they maintain and perpetuate their hatred and desire to annihilate the state of Israel and the Jewish people, but actually UNRWA is a terrorist organization in and of itself, and also as an organization that's enmeshed within the Hamas hierarchy, whether they serve as the welfare department of Hamas's regime, the health department, the education department of Hamas's regime. They operate most of the schools, most of the clinics, most of the hospitals in Gaza, or whether they are actual fighters on the ground massacring Israelis on October 7th and carrying out missile assaults against Israel in Gaza since, and attacks on IDF forces in Gaza since. It doesn't matter. UNRWA is a terrorist organization. That's what Israel discovered. I mean, that's the big reveal since October 7th about UNRWA, that it's not a relief organization. You can call it a Hamas auxiliary, but I think that a more credible way to describe it is that UNRWA is a terrorist organization, and it's 360 degrees. It's indoctrination, it's feeding, it's clothing, it's caring for providing medical attention to Hamas terrorists, UNRWA terrorists, whose sole organizing principle of all of these things is to maintain, carry out, and win their war to annihilate the Jewish people and the Jewish state. So UNRWA is a terrorist organization. After October 7th, the United States, along with a lot of other countries, announced that they were going to stop funding UNRWA. This was something that the Biden administration desperately didn't want to do. They give UNRWA close to $1 billion a year. They wanted to keep funding it, but they couldn't because, hello, it's a terrorist organization. But they have since stated that they want to renew the funding regardless, and they've been taking concerted steps to block Israel from pushing UNRWA out of the business of distributing the humanitarian aid. Well, the Knesset finally had enough of this garbage. And Likud MKs Yuli Edelstein and Boaz Bismuth put out this bill that called for making UNRWA illegal and making it them and barring them from operating in Israel. And guess what? On Tuesday, the bill passed the Knesset 92 to zip. Okay, I think 92. So nearly unanimously out of 120 people, nobody voted against it. And that's that. Bye-bye. Except what happened? The Biden-Harris administration, Tony Blinken's State Department, went bananas. Tony Blinken was here last week. He reportedly discussed the legislation with the prime minister on October 13th. If you recall, Blinken and Defense Secretary and the Defense Secretary co-signed a letter to Defense Minister here, Yoav Gallant, and Strategic Affairs Minister Lloyd Austin and Blinken. They signed this letter on October 13th where they threatened an arms embargo against Israel if Israel blocked humanitarian aid to Gaza. And they said, among other things, that passing the UNRWA law was going to undermine the distribution of humanitarian aid, indicating very clearly that if the Knesset dared to ban UNRWA from operating in Israel, that the United States was going to place a full embargo on arms sales, arms deliveries to Israel. Okay? And so what they're doing is actively protecting a terrorist organization. And here I just want to read a couple of these snippets of what State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said in defense of UNRWA. And again, the United States knows all of the information that Israel has about UNRWA. Israel has been pushing out this information, right, to make clear to everybody concerned that UNRWA is, in fact, a terrorist organization. And the Biden administration dutifully stopped funding UNRWA because you're not allowed to fund terrorist organizations, right? But they want to renew that aid. And so this is what Miller said. He said on Monday, so the day before the Knesset voted, he said that Knesset's passage of the bill could have implications under U.S. law, meaning we're going to put an arms embargo. And then he says, UNRWA plays an irreplaceable role right now in Gaza, where they're on the front lines. They're miracle workers, right? Of getting humanitarian assistance to the people that need it. There's nobody that can replace them right now in the middle of the crisis. So they're enabling Hamas, right, to continue to control life in Gaza, to be the regime in Gaza, because they are Hamas. And the United States is saying that you can't get rid of Hamas's welfare agency, because if you do, you're going to hurt Hamas-controlled Gaza, where you're going to hurt the people. The thing is that the people of Gaza themselves, to the extent that they're suffering because they're being denied this humanitarian aid that the United States insists on flooding Gaza with by UNRWA. UNRWA is giving all of the aid because UNRWA is Hamas. UNRWA controls all of the aid, gives it to Hamas, and then Hamas, at most, will sell it to the people. So the humanitarian crisis that the United States keeps railing against is a product of the fact that UNRWA is controlling the delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. And here is Matthew Miller saying that if UNRWA goes away, you will see civilians, including children, including babies, not be able to get access to food and water and medicine that they need. We find that unacceptable. But the reason that they don't get access to it now is because of UNRWA, right? So the whole thing is just the opposite of reality, right? And then he says, we continue to urge the government of Israel to pause the implementation of this legislation. We urge them not to pass it at all, and we will consider next steps based on what happens in the days ahead. Then he went on and on and on. He even said that the U.S. thinks it's too bad that they're not funding UNRWA. He said here, he said that that the ban on funding UNRWA should be lifted because UNRWA has engaged in important reforms. No, it hasn't. And then he blamed Israel. He said Israel hasn't provided information about its allegations against UNRWA to UNRWA. But why would you? That's giving the cat the cream. Guard the cream. We're going to give you all of this intelligence information that we have about you, so that you know who you are. You know that hostages were being held by your personnel. You know that your clinics were used as weapon storage areas and weapon and missile launching pads, right? You know these things. You know it. You know all of it. You agreed to it because you are terrorists. Philip Lazzarini, UN leader, all of you know it. Antonio Guterres, you know it too, UN Secretary General. All of you people know exactly what UNRWA is doing. In January, a bunch of survivors and victims of October 7th submitted a lawsuit in U.S. federal court in New York, suing UNRWA for $1 billion in damages because UNRWA has been funding Hamas for years. Now, what happened? So UNRWA insisted on paying all of its employees, thousands and thousands of employees in Gaza, in dollars. Okay, and the currency that you use in Gaza are the shekels, Israeli currency. So in order for UNRWA employees to be able to actually use the money that they were making from UNRWA in Gaza, they had to change the money into shekels. Who has a monopoly on changing money? Hamas. And what commission does Hamas take for changing dollars into shekels? 25%. So UNRWA, by paying their employees with, by the way, U.S. is paying this, right? Because they pay, I think, 22% of UNRWA's budget until they cut them off. So this is wild. The U.S. was funding UNRWA's budget to the tune of nearly $1 billion a year. UNRWA was using this payment scheme of paying its employees in dollars, knowing that Hamas was going to get 25 cents on every dollar that they get in order to fund its terrorist budget. Okay, so UNRWA is directly funding Hamas, but through this scheme of payment in dollars to its employees, right? So the victims of October 7th, they're suing UNRWA for $1 billion. I think it should be more like $1 trillion, but whatever, for their funding of Hamas over time. This was a multi-year policy in federal court. So UNRWA is also funding Hamas. And here is the United States saying, we think that, Israel is to blame because they're not giving their information to UNRWA itself so that they can carry out an investigation. Right. So this is just simply bad faith. And so the United States goes nuts about this. You have all of these governments in the West who are saying you can't do this. I think Canada and Germany restored their funding to UNRWA a while back, right? So that, they're angry. All of these people are angry. All of these government leaders who are supposedly fair people are all mad at Israel for cutting off UNRWA. And now, what's funny about this is that there was a story this morning that I read in Ynet that was talking about the fact that actually Israel found a solution for the humanitarian aid. And what Israel did was it agreed to have a U.S. contractor who has operated in Afghanistan and in Iraq and providing, logistical support for U.S. operations and humanitarian aid called GDC. They just got, and the Americans just signed a contract with them that they're supposed to be responsible for dispersing humanitarian aid. And these are, former Navy SEALs, former Green Berets, and SAS soldiers from Britain, et cetera. None of them are Israeli, none of them are Jews. And they're supposed to be in charge of the aid convoys and distribution to Gaza. So there already is a mechanism in place that the Americans themselves have approved. They signed a $200 million contract with GDC for this purpose, right? So they know that there's a solution. Israel, I think we should be distributing the aid, but Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who is very close to the administration, and Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, also very close to the Americans, they said no, but they agreed to do this thing with the U.S. contractor, and the Americans already agreed to it as well. So you have this American contractor with proven experience in battlefield of Iraq and Afghanistan, working closely with U.S. forces on, in both countries, that there's the ones who are supposed to be distributing the humanitarian aid, and they have a pilot set up in northern Gaza, and the whole thing is, ready to go. And here are the Americans threatening to place an embargo on Israel of arms sales because we're pushing out a terrorist organization. So this is, this is obviously, I'm very happy that the law passed. I think it wasn't broad enough. It only talked about UNRWA operations inside of sovereign Israel. It should also include Judea and Samaria. It should also include Gaza. But be that as it may, I'm not quite sure what the ripple effect will be of the law inside of Gaza and Judea and Samaria. Hopefully it'll be broadened, if Trump wins the elections. But what you're seeing with Matthew Miller's response, with the fact that Tony Blinken came to Israel last week, and among other things that he was doing to pressure Israel, aside from causing any, blocking us from causing any significant strategic damage over time to Iran and protecting Iran's nuclear installations from an Israeli airstrikes, he was also trying to protect UNRWA from the Knesset. Aside from the fact that what this means is that they are actively protecting a terrorist organization, which is horrible, they're doing something else, which is trying to undermine Israel's sovereignty as a democracy. It's the Knesset. It's the Knesset passed this law 92 or 97 to nothing, right? Just nearly unanimously. And that is because there is a consensus among Israelis that UNRWA has to go because it is a terrorist organization. It's not just a hostile political organization, a hostile educational organization. It is an active terrorist organization. And Israel is being reviled for killing its operatives who massacred our people, who kidnapped our people. Israel is being attacked. The UN and all of these Western governments are attacking Israel for going after terrorists who are employed by the United Nations instead of being embarrassed. I think that speaks to the utter corruption of the UN system, and everybody who upholds it, there's something wrong with them morally, and their moral compass has to be fixed, right? Because the idea that, the UN can be the repository of, power, that we're supposed to transfer our sovereign power to the UN as nation states, whether it's Israel or Canada or the United States or Mexico or anywhere, is insane because this is an utterly corrupt institution. Why would you hand over any of your national power to this institution? I think more than anything else, aside from, what this means about the moral corruption of the Biden administration, that it wants to continue to support UNRWA, I think it speaks to the screaming need for a future American administration to stop funding the UN, to start thinking very seriously about whether the UN should be allowed to be sitting on some of the most expensive and important real estate in Manhattan. Why should it be allowed to continue to be headquartered in the United States? If it's such an important organization to the developing world, then it should be located, its headquarters should be located in a war zone, where they really need them. like Sudan, for instance. Why doesn't the UN relocate its headquarters to Khartoum? I think that would be great. It could really do something for the suffering of that country that can't seem to get it right. Or they could go to, they could go somewhere else. They could go to Iraq. Why don't they go to Iraq? Iraq's a poor country. It's been suffering forever. Why doesn't the UN relocate to Baghdad? Why does it have to be on the East River? I think that, somebody has to rethink this. It's such an utterly corrupt organization. It's advancing goals that are antithetical to the UN, what is it called? The Declaration of Universal Rights or whatever. It's like all of its founding documents are about peace and protection and yada, 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 and freedom. But its operations here are completely a defense of terrorist organizations and of genocide. So hats off to the Knesset, hats off to all of the members of Knesset who voted for this, hats off to Prime Minister Netanyahu for standing up to the U.S. And hopefully, this contractor, together with the IDF, are going to be able to sort this out, because if you continue to have Hamas in charge of distributing humanitarian aid and then selling it, not only are they able to protect their own financial viability on the ground in Gaza and continue to mobilize cadres and bring them into the fold of Hamas, train them, etc., you're denying the humanitarian aid that you claim that you want to give to the actual people of Gaza. Those who aren't in the good graces of Hamas are the ones that are suffering, and those are the ones that you want to empower. So I think, again, this is just another indication that this isn't a 7-front war. It's very much an 8-front war. And it would be fantastic if, Israel didn't have to fight that eighth front. If, or at least we had the United States on our side rather than threatening to embargo us if we protect ourselves from a UN terrorist organization operating on behalf of, and in fact, as one of Israel's terrorist enemies. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. And I'll see you again later. I'm going to have an interview with Ambassador David Friedman coming up later this week about his new book about a one-state solution to everything. Anyway, I'll talk to you soon. Take care.